Welcome everyone to this Yad Vashem Zoom lecture, especially the survivors in the audience who have a personal connection to tonight's subject matter. My name is Vera Boyarsky and I live in Sydney, Australia. I was born in Hungary and came to Australia as a young girl with my parents on December the 5th, 1956, during the Hungarian uprising against Soviet rule. My father was born in Győr and my mother in a town called Tenyő. Miraculously, they both survived a number of concentration camps. My mother, Auschwitz, my father, on the other hand, first dragged off to labor camp, then was taken to Mauthausen, from where he was liberated, extremely ill with typhus. Like many Hungarian Jews, they lost immediate family and relatives, both in Nazi concentration camps and as conscripted slaves. The Hungarian Jewish forced laborers were sent to the Eastern Front. This plight is the subject of today's lecture. Like many Jewish immigrants in the post-war period, my parents came to Australia with nothing, sponsored as refugees, and then began their lives middle-aged, working extremely hard. My father, a brilliant and revered engineer, had difficulty with English, so I became his interpreter, thus learning many skills from him, which in turn inspired me to choose mechanical engineering and an arts degree from the University of New South Wales. I vividly recall that in the first year after our arrival in Australia, my father gave £50 to Israel, which in those times was 4 weeks' salary at least. That was a huge amount, especially for my parents as refugees who had no knowledge of English, a very young child, and a pitiful income from 2 jobs, and no roof over their heads to call their own. My mother, shocked by the amount, asked my father, "What were you thinking?" He answered, "In Israel, they're giving their lives to defend the Jewish state. We're just giving money." I have never forgotten this statement. It has been with me growing up, committed to our heritage and hopes of peace and prosperity for the future of Israel and the diaspora Jews. My father's sentiments have shaped our family's commitment ever since. He has left a remarkable legacy to all his offspring. Both my husband Alex and I, daughter Michelle, and my son Andrew with his wife Taryn, are privileged to give back to the Jewish people through leadership roles in major Jewish organizations. We are also Yad Vashem benefactors in order to honor my parents, Elizabeth and Imre Steiner, in a way that would be most meaningful to them and our future generations. They both valued education as a means to freedom and a quality of life, no matter where one finds oneself in the world. As my son Andrew so wisely said, there is always a conflict between local and overseas needs, but not in the case of Yad Vashem. It educates so many Australians and others in the world with the desire to change people's thinking and bring hope for a more cohesive, tolerant world. Personally, I had the privilege of interviewing a dozen Holocaust survivors in Hungarian. Their plight has moved me till the end of time. I'm so grateful to have a place called Yad Vashem where every testimony has a place of significance, a home that cares about each one with dignity. My mother's testimony is also housed there. so future generations of our family will be aware of our family's history and our association with this great institution. I would add that Yad Vashem also educates thousands of educators from all around the world, and the vast majority of whom are not Jewish. And each educator teaches thousands of students during their course of their teaching careers, and as such is on the forefront of the fight against hatred. Accordingly, Yad Vashem probably does more to combat anti-Semitism than any other organization. To quote Elie Wiesel, "If we, the survivors, decide to tell the tale, it is because we wanted the world to be a better world, just a better world, to learn and remember." Clearly, it is painful for survivors to talk about their experience during the Holocaust, but they do at a great emotional cost, so people learn the lessons from their experiences to reduce the likelihood of mankind perpetrating these indescribable crimes in future generations. Yad Vashem's global Holocaust education activities help make the world a better place through emphasizing the crucial role of moral values in decision-making at all levels of society in the fight against racism, anti-Semitism, hatred, and bigotry. This is particularly crucial today during these times of widespread social unrest. That is why the lecture we're about to hear is not just a history lesson, but to inform people about the consequences of man's inhumanity to man in order to increase awareness as an incentive for world leaders to do all in their power to prevent these atrocities from happening again. Our lecturer, Dr. Robert Rozett, senior historian in the International Institute for Holocaust Research at Yad Vashem. Prior to this, he was director of the Yad Vashem libraries for 25 years. He received a PhD from the Hebrew University under Professor Yehuda Bauer. His dissertation was about Jewish rescue and revolt in Slovakia and Hungary. His father, a native of Gyöngyös in Hungary, survived the Hungarian labor camps, and his paternal grandmother survived both Auschwitz and the Trautenau labor camp. Dr. Rozett has studied and documented the journey of people who have suffered for no other reason than being Jewish in Hungary. Dr. Rozett has authored and edited scholarly books and articles, as well as pieces for the popular press. Among his many scholarly publications, he has written many acclaimed books, such as Conscripted Slaves, Hungarian Jewish forced laborers on the Eastern Front during the Second World War, and his most recent, After So Much Pain and Anguish, First Letters After Liberation, which he edited with Dr. Lael Needham Orvieto. Dr. Rozett has guided many world leaders through Yad Vashem and has lectured widely around the world. He is also a member of Israel's delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Needing no further introduction, I call on our distinguished lecturer to begin his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The lecture that I'm about to give you is, I think it reflects very much my generation of Holocaust scholars, in the sense that each of us deals with the universal aspects of the Holocaust. We deal with the national Jewish aspects of the Holocaust, and some aspects of the Holocaust can be deeply personal for us. This lecture and the book that I wrote about the Hungarian Jewish forced laborers on the Eastern Front was something I unfortunately only was able to come to and was ready to come to some years after my father passed away. But this was also his story. And I guess the way I thought I should deal with it was not to try to just talk about my father, but to try to talk about the phenomenon. What I really tried to do in the book, and what I'll hope to do for you today to a certain extent, is I wanted to show this story from the point of view of the men who went through it as best as I could. And so Vera talked about memoirs, testimonies, and taking testimonies. This personal aspect of the testimonies, the memoirs, was very central to trying to get to that point of view for what I was doing. So let's begin. Attila Peshauer was a very well-known person in Hungary between the wars. He was born in 1901. In 1923, he won the bronze medal in the European Championships in the individual saber competition. In 1928, in the Olympics in Amsterdam, he won the silver medal for that same competition, and he also won gold medals in the team saber competition there, and then later in 1932 in Los Angeles. So as a famous athlete in Hungary between the wars, he was thought to be as somebody who had brought glory to the Hungarian nation. And as such, when the labor service was established, which I'll explain in a moment how it came about, he was exempt from being drafted into it in the beginning. Now, there's a story that's told that is impossible to absolutely validate, but this is the story as I've learned it, that Peshauer one day was in the Ministry of War, and there a very high-ranking officer recognized him, and he shouted at him, "You stinking Jew." Peshauer, who was a man of tremendous honor, right, came up to this officer, he slapped him in the face a few times, and then he left. The officer was infuriated, and he decided that Peshauer needed to be drafted immediately. The following morning, he had to show up at the train station, and he was assigned to a labor service company called the 101/4 TMSC company. He had nothing with him. He had no time to organize. He didn't have warm clothes. He didn't have any supplies. And he was sent to the Eastern Front to a place called Davidovka. When he arrived there, the person in command's name was Lieutenant Colonel Kalaman Che. Now, Che had been an Olympic athlete also. So he was essentially had been the teammate of Peshauer. When Peshauer reached Davidovka, Che ordered the Hungarian staff to hound Peshauer. We have a diary from a doctor who was there. In June 9th of 1942, his name is Dr. Lajos Somorai. And he wrote, and I quote, "Attila Peshauer, the former world fencing champion, is here among them. By now, his arrogance has been beaten out of him. He has been slapped in the face so often." The story goes that in January 12th, 1943, at a place called Novi Grand Krestiki, which is right at the front lines, and it was just then that the Soviets made a counterattack on Hungarian troops there, and the lines were collapsing. The story goes that Hungarian soldiers tied Peshauer to a tree. He was naked. It was minus 35 degrees centigrade. They poured water on him, and he froze to death. Now, the Hungarian records say something different. They said that he went missing in action on January 12th, 1943, and there's an additional document that places his death in a field hospital. So we'll never know 100% which story is true. But what we do know is that Peshauer was harassed, and he was essentially harassed to his death. And the person most responsible for that was his fellow Olympic teammate, Kalaman Che. So this was not an anonymous incident of murder like we usually think about murder in the Holocaust. This was an incident of murder in which the two protagonists knew one another. Now, the labor service was established already before the war. The truth is that Hungary already had a tradition in its military of having laborers working with the army. And of course, that makes sense because any army also needs a certain amount of labor to go with it. It's always part of it. So in 1939, as the clouds of war were coming around Europe, the Hungarians decided they needed to rethink where they were going and reorganize their military service. And one of the things they decided was to reestablish a labor service for men who could not fight or who were considered unworthy of bearing arms for Hungary. So on May 12, 1939, this new service was set up. And very soon after, Jews as a group were defined as being unworthy of bearing arms for Hungary. By August 1941, Jews who had been serving in other units in the army, because Jews had been drafted, of course, like everybody else in regular ways before this. By 1941, Jews were essentially only serving in the labor units, and all new draftees were only being brought into the labor service. There was a small amount of Jews with very special skills who remained in regular units. At this time, drivers and mechanics, for example, were very in short supply, and so Jews who knew how to drive and fix automobiles and trucks remained in regular units, but everybody else was being put into the labor service. Eventually, by the end of the war, we can talk about 100,000 Jewish men and tens of thousands of non-Jewish men as well being taken into the labor service. More than half of the Jewish men ended up serving in Hungary until near the end, because at the end of the war, in 1944, in August, September 44, the Soviets began entering Hungarian territory, and by the end of the year, they had encircled Budapest, and by early January, by the middle of January, they actually took Pest, and then on the 12th of February 1945, they took Buda as well. And so towards this end of the war, in the last months of the war, especially after the coming to power of more or less Nazis, the Hungarian Arrow Cross, not exactly Nazis, but similar to them, men are being deported now, and women as well, and sometimes children, to the border of Austria where they're performing forced labor. So this too is part of labor service in a much wider way, but of the 100,000 men that are brought into this, all told, roughly half of them stayed in Hungary, and many of them ended up going to the Austrian border area. And then from there, some were massacred in Austrian territory early in 1945, and many of them ended up in camps, often the Mauthausen camps, the sub-camps. But our story today, what I want to talk to you about is not this piece of history, but the history of those who were sent to the Eastern Front. Now, Hungary didn't begin its invasion of the Eastern territories of the Soviet Union along with Germany on June 22nd, 1941. It took them a little while, not long, just really a matter of days, to then send troops in. And with those first troops that went into the Soviet territories, there were forced laborers with them as well, maybe around 6,000 or so. Most of the Hungarian troops were withdrawn near the end of 1941. The Germans weren't very happy with the way they were working in that area. They brought them back to Hungary. They reorganized some more. In the spring of 1942 began a very big push of sending Hungarian troops into the Soviet territories that the Germans had now taken, right? And all the way up to this front, the Stalingrad line, as it was called, at a place called Voronezh, that's where the Hungarian troops were. So beginning in April 1942, the Hungarians sent about 200,000 troops to the front. Eventually, they would send about 250,000. And eventually, there would be something around 45,000 Jewish forced laborers who were sent with them to the Eastern Front. Now, most of the forced laborers were younger men. The ones being called up were usually between the ages of 18 and 42, and then they extended it to 18 and 48. But in the material we have at Yad Vashem, where we have a card listing of Jewish forced laborers who either were murdered or were missing in action, disappeared, as it were, the oldest person there is 71 years old. So some people were specifically chosen out because they were seen in some way to be greater enemies of the regime, and these Jewish men also were taken. Most companies had about 212 men, although sometimes they were bigger, sometimes they were smaller. Usually they had a junior officer, meaning a captain or below, and then they had non-coms and private Hungarian soldiers who were in charge of them, essentially a handful. From spring 1942 onward, the Hungarian Jewish forced laborers were not given uniforms, only a hat and an armband and sometimes boots, which meant, for example, when Petschauer had to go, normally he would have bought supplies for himself at this point, but because they weren't given anything, again, maybe boots at the best, but he didn't even have time to do that when he was sent. Now, of the 45,000 or so Jewish forced laborers sent to the Eastern Front over the course of 42, 43, and then into the summer of 44, 80% of them never came home. They were either killed, they were missing in action, or they ended up becoming Soviet prisoners of war and dying in captivity under the Soviets. So this labor service was not set up in order to murder Jews. It was set up in order to serve the Hungarian military. And of course, the racism and the prejudice we've seen is that the idea is that the Jews aren't worthy of fighting for Hungary, so they can only do labor for Hungary. But again, it's not set up with any express or clear message that says that the Jews are supposed to be killed through this labor service. But that's what happened. It became so deadly. And so the question we ask when we look at it is, why did it become so deadly? What happened to it? How did the men experience it? And what was happening to them that made it so deadly? Well, the first answer to the question has to do with the war itself. And of course, the war on the Eastern Front was very brutal at times. Of course, we all know the Blitzkrieg and the fact that the Germans and their allies were gobbling up territory in the Soviet Union until December of 1941, when they were stopped outside of Moscow, and then they ended up holding a line, what we call the Stalingrad line, where they were there until early 1943. So there was a period of a lot of fighting, then a period of less fighting, and then the Soviet counterattack. And the Soviet counterattack on the Stalingrad line, of course, led to tremendous losses of the German troops in February of 1943 with the loss of Stalingrad. But on the Hungarian portion of the line, at the town of Voronezh, between January 12th and January 30th, there was a devastating attack by the Soviet forces. And it's estimated that the losses for the Hungarian troops were about 80,000 men, casualties of killed, wounded, or missing. And it adds to the understanding to say that there were 5,000 horses that were killed. 5,000 horses as well. The horsepower was what they used on the Eastern Front because of all the mud and everything else. And this tremendous devastation. And during that battle itself, of course, many of the Hungarian Jewish forced laborers were killed, and many others went missing in action, and many of them fell to the Soviets as POWs at that time. Now, the general brutality of the war on the Eastern Front certainly contributed to a general breakdown of morality among the troops that were there. And we know this from many sources. We know it, for example, from German sources, what it's like to be on the Eastern Front, even for women who were posted on the Eastern Front in some capacity or were there with their husbands. Professor Wendy Lauer wrote a very, very thought-provoking book called The Furies, which is about a number of portraits of some German women who ended up on the Eastern Front. And she talks about how some of them really themselves became murderers on the Eastern Front, even though they weren't there in that capacity in any way. They weren't soldiers, but they ended up really becoming murderers out of this breakdown of morality, this shift in morals that was going on in the period. So the Hungarian troops certainly became much more brutalized because of this, and this certainly feeds into their brutal treatment of the Hungarian forced laborers. Before I talk more about the treatment, it's also very important to understand that even if we can say that to a very large extent, it was the attitude of the Hungarian commanders and men and soldiers that were with the forced laborers that so much fed the brutality, there were some who treated them well. One of the most well-known is named Vilmos Nagybáty, and he was the Minister of Defense from September 1942 to 43, and he gave orders in December of 1942, official orders saying that the Jewish forced laborers need to be treated just like other Hungarian soldiers. Now, we know that these orders were not always followed in the Eastern Front. In fact, quite often they weren't followed, but he did give that order as the defense minister. And eventually he was awarded as a righteous among the nations for that. And there's a number of other righteous among the nations from the forced labor units we can talk about. Among the most well-known are Bela Kirai and Barna Kish, and again, a few others. And all of these men, the common thing about them is that they all really cared about the welfare of the Jewish forced laborers under their command. And they all made efforts to protect them from the worst of the anti-Semitism. Also, sometimes when the SS would try to murder these men, keep them out of their hands. And they certainly did what they could to bring them home safely, and that's what they tried to do. And I think that's the common thing we can see about the Hungarian Jewish forced labor commanders, who later were recognized as righteous among the nations. But the prevailing feeling of the Hungarian Jewish forced laborers was not that somebody was protecting them. That was much less common. And many of the forced laborers say in their memoirs and their testimonies, they talk about even before they were being sent out to the Eastern Front, while they were still in Hungary, getting what training they got, being brought together, there was often things said to them that made it very clear that they were not going to be treated well, and even worse. And in his memoir, Andrei Barat writes about the first lieutenant in charge of them, a man named Gyula Gecho. And he writes in the memoir, the speech Gyula Getchell made to them in their unit, the 101/38. And of course, as a historian, I tell you, somebody writing down a verbatim speech in a memoir, you can't write down a verbatim speech because you can't remember every word. That's quite difficult to do, even if you did it just very shortly after. This memoir was written in 1948. But you can remember pretty much what was said and the tone of what was said. And I'm quite sure some of the phrases would stick in your mind if they made a big enough impression on you. So this is how he quotes Gyula Getchell. "Listen to me, I hate you. It's right. I'm a frank man. I'll tell it like it is. Don't believe that I'm afraid to say it. I always hated. Moreover, I'll always have hatred for you. Do you understand? I don't deny it. I'm not ashamed of it. Moreover, I'm proud of it. And you won't think that I came because of my own will. I'm a soldier. I go wherever I'm sent. Now I was sent to this bloody, dirty slave labor company. Why was it me, would you ask somebody? I'll tell you, because they know me. They know that First Lieutenant Getchell, Gyula, who has never kept his feelings secret. They know that I hate you. And above all, they want me to pull your dirty skin off. I'll always execute orders. I'm a soldier. I'm merciless. Merciless. I'm a man. But more, I'm a soldier. Do you understand? I'm a man, but you are not. Now I can tell you that only you will die under my arms, you dirty, stinking Jews. You will die. Understand? Answer me." So this is how he recorded the speech of his lieutenant before they were taken to the Eastern Front. Now, there's no question that anti-Semitism lay very deeply at the root of the mistreatment of the Hungarian Jewish forced laborers. And at least many of the soldiers, if they were not deeply, deeply anti-Semitic, they still believed that the Jews in some way must have done something wrong to be sent to such units. They were being punished. And so if they were being punished, it was their role to make sure they were being punished. And so they treated them accordingly. So that's part of the dynamic that happens here as well. Now, conditions on the front, of course, were very difficult for everyone, but they were really worse for the forced labor servicemen. As I said, they had to provide their own clothing. And when it wore out, unlike regular soldiers, there were no supplies for them. There was no way they could get new boots or new pants or new anything. And they were there, sometimes there for a long time, sometimes there from sometime in the spring or summer of 1942 until, if they managed to survive at all, until the early autumn or late summer of 1944. In addition to that, they were subject to extortion and theft. Almost everybody heading towards the Eastern Front went through a place called Novi Oskol. And that was there, it was in that place that towards this front on the Stalingrad line, on the Don River front, that the soldiers went through, and it was where Hungarian headquarters were there. And almost everyone in their memoirs remembers being robbed when they went through this point. They were robbed by the gendarmes, the military gendarmes of the Hungarian army, and often in collusion with their own commanders, in which then the gendarmes and the commanders split whatever they took from these men, again, who had supplied themselves, so there was something to take from them. In the field itself, one of the most common things the men write about is that their food supplies were not given to them as they should be. Very frequently, the Hungarian commanders and soldiers serving with them stole their supplies. They went to them, and then they would sell the Hungarian Jewish forced laborers supplies for a profit. And then sometimes what they did was they would sell some of the food back to them, and the forced laborers would have to give them an IOU to them that they owed them money. And the forced laborers were not sent home on leave, although some of them ended up being sent home for various reasons during the course of their service, but most of them not. But the regular soldiers, especially the officers, could go home on leave. And we know many stories about how they would approach the families of the forced laborers with the IOU, with the signature of the forced laborer, of course, which the family recognized. And then they would pay money to this Hungarian soldier. And that, again, was money that was used to buy food that was supposed to be theirs. Their sleeping arrangements were, let's say, less than good. That would be a nice way to say it. They were really unfit most of the time. And in good situations, they were placed in barns. But barns, as you know, are not meant for human beings to be in, and they tend to be drafty and leaking rain. And you can imagine what it means to be in a barn when it's minus 35 or minus 40 degrees. And so it doesn't give you a whole lot of protection from the elements, but it's still better than nothing. Often they really had nothing. They were sleeping in just dugouts in the ground. They had to dig a place out to be. And again, the weather in the Soviet Union where they were, in the areas where they were, in the summer it could be terribly hot. And again, in the winter it was horribly freezing. And in the springtime there were torrential rains and mud. And so not having normal accommodations was devastating for most of these men. Practicing hygiene. Even soldiers on the front, they do their best somehow to practice hygiene, to be clean if they can be, as well as they can be. But these men were not allowed to do it often, or they were given so little time to do it, or they had one water spigot for the whole company, and they only had a few minutes to try to get cleaned up. So that hygiene was really impossible. And of course, where there's no hygiene, there's going to be disease. And so the men suffered very much from malnutrition, from dysentery. Lice were everywhere. And of course, lice then spread disease, as do fleas, which were everywhere. And they were plagued by typhus that was very, very common for them. And so disease was also one of the things that made the service so deadly for these men. They were in a labor service, so obviously they were performing labor. And much of it was really backbreaking labor, difficult labor. They were cutting trees, repairing roads, removing snow. And again, not just snow. I don't know in Australia how much snow you get. I don't think you get very much, but I grew up in New Jersey and I had actually nice times cleaning snow in various times of my life, but that's not what they were doing. They were cleaning, really meters deep snow that just came back again. And the work was hard. But it wasn't just that the work was hard, it was that they were often treated with tremendous brutality and cruelty by the soldiers that were in charge of them. There was a post-war trial of an officer named Bele Travai, who commanded a company called the 109/1. And we know from the trial that Travai would often order his men to sing out loud. When he thought they weren't singing loudly enough, he would like to take them into the local river or lake, wherever they were, in their full gear and to go in. So again, depending on the weather, this could be really horrible to be made to go in, and certainly with your full gear, it makes all your gear wet and everything else. We know that in the winter, he often liked to call for drills in the middle of the night. So these exhausted men who've been working all day finally get to sleep, and he wakes them up in the middle of the night, and they would have to come out of wherever they were sleeping barefoot and then stand in their underwear and their shirts again in the winter in the Arctic cold, because he would have a roll call or else to do drills of some sort. We know that Travai did not treat slackers nicely, as he would think of them as slackers. So men who, for example, had frostbite, which was quite serious, would ask to be on sick call, and Travai's most common response was to hit them with a stick where they had frostbite. He was so notorious for punching his men in the face, just below the eye, that his company came to be known as the Black-Eyed Company. And we also know that he would subject some of the men, usually half a dozen or so every Sunday, to a very old punishment they had in the Hungarian military, which was to take people and to hang them after having tied their hands behind their back, and to raise them, or sometimes truss them up with their hands tied to their ankles behind their back and then hang them as well. And this is a deeply painful thing. So this is the kind of cruelty the men would experience on an ongoing basis in some of the units. It wasn't just physical cruelty, there's also mental cruelty. Some of them in their testimonies talk about something that many of the men were made to do, often early after they got to the Eastern Front, and that's that they were made to pull wagons in place of the horses. Now, it wasn't because the horses were suffering at this point early on, it was just because it was thought to be a fun thing to do by the commanders. And they would hitch the men up to the wagons. And some of the men talk about their testimonies and memoirs about how terribly humiliating it was to be made to act like a beast, like a horse. So these kinds of activities, again, were humiliating and painful and cruel and brutal. Now, some jobs that they performed also were very dangerous to life and limb. We know that on the Stalingrad line near Voronezh, that one of the jobs that the forced laborers had was to bring food up to the men at the very front of the line. They also, to the soldiers, they also had to lay barbed wire at the front of the line. And they also had to look for the corpses of those who had been killed and bring them back. So they were on the very front. They were actually between the Soviets and the Hungarians. And unlike regular soldiers, they didn't have any equipment. They didn't have a helmet. They didn't have a flak jacket. They had nothing. And we also know that not only the Soviets shot at them because they saw them as Hungarian military, but the Hungarians liked to shoot at them as well for sport. And so this was a very dangerous thing to do, and it was a very, very common thing they had to do. There was outright murder that happened on the part of the Hungarians. There was a trial also of another lieutenant, the name was George Kalski. And he frankly admitted to shooting many of the men in his unit. We know that by the beginning of October of 1942, he had 96 men in his unit of 212 executed, and he personally shot 30. And the way he did it, often to kill them, was he would send out one or two of the forced laborers with a soldier. They'd send them out to a village, supposedly to bring back food or to go get water or something. The soldier that was sent with them would murder them and then report back that they had been shot while trying to escape. One of the things that comes out in many of the memoirs, again, is something that is beyond our belief that they did to the forced laborers, but that, again, happened. Of course, mines are a problem on any military front, and mines need to be either taken out of the ground or to know where they are and to be mapped. The Hungarian military often liked to use the Jewish forced laborers as human minesweepers. They would give them really no instructions, very little, and give them perhaps a stick or a bayonet and have them walk and hopefully find a mine. But if they found a mine by digging it out, that was good, but they could also find a mine by stepping on it. And if the forced laborer was injured or killed doing this, okay, that was the price as far as the commanders were concerned. We know that sometimes Jewish forced laborers were really just put in front of the Hungarian troops who were marching, again, to be human mine detectors. And once again, so that if anybody would step on a mine, it would be one of the Jews. So this is outright murder, because the injury would lead to death probably, or else being killed immediately. There was one incident that's infamous in the story of the men on the Eastern Front. Typhus was a terrible problem. Many, many of the forced laborers had it. About 600 to 800 of them, we don't know the exact numbers, in April of 1943 had been sent to a kolkhoz at a place called Doroshice, and they were housed in a barn. We know from a number of testimonies that what they did one day in April of 1943, the Hungarians, was they surrounded the barn, they put machine guns around it, and they set it afire. So that was almost impossible to get out. A few people somehow managed to get out. We know, again, the minimum 400 were killed, probably more. Now, typhus was a problem for the Hungarian military. The Jews with typhus were certainly a problem for them. So this is, I guess, how they believe they should deal with it. Just murder the Jews, and then you won't have typhus. You won't have it spread to other people. So the murder of Doroshice, again, is quite infamous in the stories, the memoirs, and the writings and the testimonies of forced laborers who were there or certainly heard about it directly from some of the survivors later on. Now, this all makes this labor service terribly deadly. Another place that we can talk about where so many suffered is that they fell as prisoners of war to the Soviets. Now, at the battle in Voronezh in January of 1943, again, the same time as Stalingrad is in the process of falling, the Soviets would get hundreds of thousands, literally, of prisoners of war from this. And they were absolutely unequipped for this. They did not plan for it. And of course, the Soviet Union in the early 1943 is fighting for its life. And everywhere, except perhaps for the party potentiates, everybody's suffering from a lack of goods and everything else. And at the very bottom of the totem pole are the prisoners of war. And so that we know in those first months after men became prisoners of war, the Germans, the Hungarian soldiers, the Italians, the Romanians, and the Jewish forced laborers, they really had nothing. And so many of them just died in this first period of starvation, disease, of being out in the elements, because nothing was set up for them. After a while, things were set up for them. And many of those who survived these first months after this big battle, many of them then somehow managed to survive forced labor, frequently because they met a Jewish physician or nurse or a Jewish officer among the Soviets who listened to them and took care of them. Because unlike the Nazis who were murdering people, especially Jews, out of ideology, the Soviet regime, once they got to a certain point, wanted to actually turn them into laborers. And so a certain amount of physical care was part of making them into laborers. And in the Soviet system, in the prisoner of war camps and the gulags, if you worked, you would get your quota of food, which was something you could live on. You weren't happy with it, I guess, but it was something you could live on. If you didn't work enough, you got less. And if you worked more, you got more. And that's how they worked. And so some of these Hungarian Jewish forced laborers, for various reasons, falling into the Soviet system, did survive, but still around 75% of them never did. And I think about 16,000 men between 1942 and summer of 44, Jewish forced laborers became Soviet POWs, and less than 4,000 of them eventually returned to home. So this also became murderous for different reasons in a different way, but it too was part of the deadliness of the forced labor units. Now, within all of this, if we get back to those that before they become POWs, those that are serving under the Hungarians, there were flickers of humanity. As I said before, there were some commanders and others who were made righteous among the nations because they were much more humane. In his memoir, Elimar Shali talks about something that happened December 1942. He talks about how he was with a comrade named Bendetz, and they were marching with their unit, and they got separated. It was a long march. Some of these men marched really hundreds, even 1,000 kilometers, and they got separated from their unit. They were far behind them. They were trying to march to the front lines at a place called Yekaterinovka. And as they got to Yekaterinovka, they asked the soldier for directions, and to their amazement, the soldier responded to them in a very civilized way and told them where to go, but they still got lost. So then they encountered a corporal, and they started a conversation with the corporal. And again, the corporal responded to them as they were, in a normative way. And they learned that the corporal was responsible for a barn with horses in it. And they asked him if they go into the barn to warm up for a while, because after all, it was December and it was quite cold. So they were in the barn. And as they were in the barn, they noticed that there were soldiers coming out of a large building carrying food, and they came to some understanding, was this a hospital? And they figured maybe it was. And so they gathered up courage to go into the building. And when they went into the building, another soldier led them to a cook. And the cook immediately sat them down by a heater, and he brought them warm bean soup and bread. Now, they were eating, and as the cook was watching them, he began to cry because the men's lice began to warm up because of the heat, and they began to scratch. And the cook was so taken aback by seeing the horrible condition these men were in. But what he said to them was, don't be ashamed, scratch yourselves. It's not your fault that you're in this situation. You have nothing to be ashamed of. They were so stunned, the two Jewish forced laborers, by this expression of humanity, that they say, at least he writes in his memoir, Shali, that they forgot to scratch. And they ate. And when they finished eating, they got up to thank the cook. And the cook shook their hands and he said, before you leave the kitchen, before you leave, you should go, there's a bathhouse. And tell the attendant on duty that I sent you to the bathhouse. And they went to the bathhouse. And the bath attendant drew them hot water, and he took their clothing to be disinfected. And they went into the bathhouse thinking, what chutzpah, right? Cheek it is, that they can go and take a bath, and this is their good fortune, but they did. And so they took their bath and they got cleaned up, and while they're waiting for their clothes to get back, the attendant, who was an elderly soldier, told them to wait around, and then he gave them some potatoes to cook in the hot water, and they had some more to eat. And Shalai writes, we started weeping silently. We could not control our nerves. They were numb to rawness, but responded to the deep and unexpected manifestation of goodness. Because we lived as crushed worms, these humane gestures reminded us that once we were also counted as human beings. Now, while they were there, an officer came in, a sergeant, and he looked at these men and he saw their forced laborers. He asked the attendant, what are they doing here? And the attendant said, well, I knew them from home and I owed them a good turn. And don't worry, they'll leave when they're done. And the sergeant said, okay, but there's a pile of wood out there, and when they're done, they should go arrange the pile of wood. They got the name of the attendant and his address, and they promised that they would write to him someday. And then they left, and they had a conversation, Shalai and his friend Benedict. And they asked themselves, so which is the real Hungary? Is it this kind of kind-heartedness, or is it everything else we've gone through? And they, of course, wanted to believe that the real Hungary were these kind-hearted soldiers who treated them like human beings. But as I showed you before, that's not necessarily true. That the real Hungary at the period was a Hungary that was dominated by anti-Semitism and hatred of Jews and racism. And it was a Hungary that believed Jews were outside of their circle of responsibility at the best, and at worst should be punished and should not be brought home from the Eastern Front. Now, the situation of the forced laborers, as I said with the Peshawar story, is not the way you normally think about people being brutalized and again, eventually murdered in the Holocaust. We tend to think of it as being a very anonymous kind of thing. When we think about the shootings on the Eastern Front, they're anonymous. You have shooters shooting large amounts of people, although we do know that sometimes some of those shooters knew the people they were shooting. And of course, we think of the industrialized murder of Auschwitz. But this is a different kind of a situation. This is a situation where there's intimacy. Why intimacy? Because the forced laborers sometimes came from the same towns, and everybody was brought into the labor unit from the same town or same vicinity, and they might have known some of the soldiers from that as well, but then later on they served with them for not just weeks, but for months, and sometimes even years. And so they certainly knew them. It wasn't anonymous. And so it's a little bit different when you think about it. And I think that when you think about this aspect of intimacy and the persecution that's an aspect of intimacy here, it makes us really stop and think. Because first of all, you can be intimate with somebody, know them well, and they can remain the other. And that's what happens. These Jews remain the other to these Hungarian soldiers that are treating them badly, not to the ones that are humane, of course, but to the other ones for sure. They're the other, and there's some sort of evil other. They're deserving of punishment in some way. To punish the Jews is patriotic and right. That's the value system that comes in. But when you talk about this kind of intimacy, to my mind anyway, it makes the responsibility of Hungarian soldiers and officers who are with these men even stronger, because it's so tangible. It's not abstract anymore. And it makes it, in my mind, in some ways even stronger. Now, anybody who follows the discourse about the Holocaust in Hungary, and it's sometimes in the newspapers and certainly in journals and other places these days, we know that there's a big tendency in Hungary to try to pin the Holocaust completely on the Germans, or at best to take a little bit of responsibility and say those Nazi-like Hungarian Arrow Cross that came into power in the fall of 1944, well, there were a number of bad apples who also got involved, but we, the Hungarian people, were blameless. We decry the murder of the Jews. It wasn't us, it was somebody else. And of course, again, when we look at the Holocaust in Hungary, we know that's not really true, because we know that the Great Deportation in spring of 1944, where 437,000 Jews were deported from Hungary, almost all of them to Auschwitz-Birkenau, that it was carried out certainly under the Germans' watchful eye and coordination, but the people carrying it out, the people who organized it along with the Germans, were Hungarians from the Interior Ministry, and the gendarmes and the prefects and the policemen and the local authorities. They were the ones who put these Jews into the short-term ghettos they were put in and then put them onto the trains towards Auschwitz. Now, the story of these forced laborers in the Eastern Front is really not a German story. It's a Hungarian story. There's an aspect of it that's German, because sometimes they work for German engineering groups, which, by the way, often treat them better than the Hungarian soldiers in charge of them, we know. And there were a few massacres by SS units, not too many of these men. So it's basically a Hungarian story. And it's basically a story that's unfolding, most of it, until before the occupation of Hungary by the Germans in March of 1944. So it's a very important piece of the history for that as well, because it's telling the story again to make sure that when we talk about it, we have to understand that Hungary in this period has a lot of responsibility for what's happening to the Jews, and particularly in this earlier phase, in the phase of the forced labor. So I think that's a very important part of the story as well that we need to remember. The last thing I want to say is more or less what I started with, again, that this is not just for me a personal story. I know that for many people who are Hungarian Jewish descent or married into Hungarian Jewish families, this again is their personal story. So many younger men were brought into the forced labor units, either serving in Hungary or on the Eastern Front, or then later on the border between Austria and Hungary, that this is very much a story of Hungarian Jews. But it is also a story of the Holocaust. We have to understand, and we do understand, that the Holocaust played out in many ways, that the Holocaust is primarily a German enterprise, but not completely. It's a European-wide enterprise in which everywhere we go, we find that locals were deeply involved in the persecution of their Jewish neighbors, to a larger or to a smaller extent, but they're always deeply involved. And this too is, again, part of that history of Europe as well. Okay, I'd like to take a pause now, right, and ask for any questions. If there's something you want to know that I didn't cover, please feel free to ask.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes. Now we can. Just talk close to the mic, please.
Okay. Do you know how many of the people of the Hungarians involved in the forced labor atrocities, as I would describe them, were prosecuted after the war and punished?
Yeah, thank you for the question. The truth is I never really tried to figure out just how many. I worked with a number of trials that we had, but I'm not sure how many were brought to trial after the war. There were many trials in Hungary in general, because when the communists came in, of course, they were trying the fascists, as it were, although some of the fascists quickly became communists. But there are many trials. I'd have to look it up. There's a researcher in Hungary, Laszlo Karsai, Professor Laszlo Karsai, who has written about the trials. So you could even try to look and see if you can find anything he's said online about it. Maybe he's written about it, but I don't have a number offhand. No.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you for your amazing presentation. I'm Judy Chamian. I am from Canada. I'm currently in Israel. First of all, just if you could spell for us the name of Karsai would be helpful. But I was in Hungary in February doing some research about my father, and he has been in forced labor. And all I know is the name of the camp, Orson, Belarus. That's all. My question is what are the best sources to try to find names? When I was in Hungary, I was told that much of the records were burned both by Russians and Hungarians. I don't know if it's correct. Can you suggest how we can try to track and follow up and do the research about I am interested in my father.
Yeah, thank you for the question. What we have at Yad Vashem is an index, as I said, with about 33,000 names of men who either were killed or went missing on the Eastern Front. Some of those have more information, some of them has less. Sometimes there's really not much information even in that listing, sometimes a little bit more, but it's really just a card index. I think that it's very hard to trace things. Sometimes you can find, at least what I was able to find, when you can find the units where people were in, then you can find other people that might have survived and given testimony about the unit, and then you can learn more about what happened in general. That's how I learned how my father became a prisoner of war, because I have a testimony of somebody who was with him. So he had passed away before I began this, and I learned much more details about actually how he became a POW that day when it happened, for example. So you can do things like that. There's also something called the International Tracing Service, which is now online. And okay, you know it, so maybe you've tried it, but it's incredibly wealthy. And anybody who is trying to get some sort of compensation in any way, who survived and is getting compensation, sometimes they gave their story for that, and you can find information. And so that's very useful. And then in the Hungarian archives, I don't really know. I've also heard similar things, and I'm not sure what you can find there. As I say, I have this friend, his name is Dr. Laszlo Churz in Budapest, who is now trying to look at this also with Hungarian material more than I used. He's trying to do a more, a broader kind of study on it, and I don't know what he's found. but he might have found some more things. I hesitate to give his name. I give it out so often. He's going to get back to me and say, I don't have time to work. I keep giving my name out to people. But we're good friends, so I hope he doesn't say that to me. So anyway, I don't know what's in Hungary, if you can find things or not. I also heard things like that. But I think International Tracing Service is a place to look. And if you can get some when you find an end of a piece of thread, sometimes you manage to start finding a lot more from it. And then you start looking for other people in the unit that gave testimonies that could be on the Degob, you know, the Hungarian testimonies that were given right after the war. There's a website called DEGOB. It's in Hungarian, but there's 1,000 testimonies also in English now there. And you can look at the Spielberg material, as we call it, the Visual History Archive, because even though that's late testimony, there's so much of it. So again, once you get that little piece of thread, sometimes you manage to put together a story, even if you can't get the exact personal story. You can put together a good scenario of what happened. Yeah. Anything else?
Paul Kendi, please.
Yes, my father actually was conscripted twice. He was released after the first time in not too many months, and then was reconscripted and was away for about a year and a half on the Eastern Front. And you touched on it, but very quickly at the beginning of your talk. Why do you suppose they were released and returned home only to be taken back in again to the Eastern Front? What was going on at that time? Do you know?
Again, that's a good question. When the system was originally set up, it was more normative, you know, and men were being conscripted already in 41, some even as early as 1940 into it. And they were in Hungary mostly. And then it's only with the spring of 42 that there's a big push of sending men to the Eastern Front. But in the original conscriptions, people can be sent home, and it happens. They finish. They're also sent home on furlough, and they visit their families sometimes. All kinds of things happen. Their families come visit them when they're in Hungary. It's much more normative. I think that it's just the course of the war that happens, and also all of the acts against the Jews in Hungary become more extreme from 1938 until even into 42. Various acts are being passed against them. So that might be a piece of the explanation as well. And again, the war itself, sending people out. So yes, that's a fairly common thing, that there's men who are taken in, released, and then taken in again. And then the second time they end up being sent to the Eastern Front, or they have a much worse experience. There's also sometimes where they manage to evade the second time. But yes, that comes up in the literature, not infrequently, that's what happened to people. You're muted. We can't hear you.
Paul, you have to unmute yourself.
That is exactly what happened in my father's case. And one other piece that may be of interest to you or other people, that my father survived both trips, and when the Russians began their long push back towards the west, and the front kept moving west, and that was at that point towards Hungary, he managed to lose himself in a way, to fall behind the lines, and he wanted to fall into the hands of the Russians, and he never actually was a Russian POW, but he managed to lose himself from his troops and had a long personal march back home, hiding out and working for some of the farmers along the way who would give him food. And so he had an experience that basically allowed him to survive and return home through the aids of the farmers in the field in Russia, where he would go from place to place and do a little work and move on and so forth. And that's how he managed to get home.
Well, again, that's quite a story. And I don't know of too many who managed to do that. I know of many who decided to let themselves be overrun by the Soviets, including my own father's story, because they thought the Soviets would treat them as victims of the Hungarians, right, and the Germans. Instead, they treated them as if they were personnel of the Hungarians and the Germans. But this story, I don't know, but I can say that one of the very interesting things in the testimonies I saw was, as opposed to our stereotype of the Ukrainian farmers and things, they were often very, very warm to these men because they responded to the terrible condition they were in. And there's a number of testimonies where, as they were moving back from the front after the tremendous battle in Voronezh, and then in the summer of '44, so moving out there, they end up getting cut off here and there, and they're with peasants. The peasants treat them very well. And so I'm not surprised that people treated him better. That actually comes up a lot, again, against all of our stereotypes about how the Ukrainian peasants were so anti-Semitic. And they could still be anti-Semitic and still treat them well. I mean, that's something we also know, that happens. But they often found a lot of comfort in those homes.
Tom Leimdorfer, please.
Oh, thank you. Nice to see you, Paul. As well as my father has died on the Eastern Front forced labor, and he died in those first few months in the Soviet prisoner of war camp of typhus and diphtheria. But we didn't. My grandparents and my mother didn't have confirmation until well into 1947, when somebody came back from the front who was with him at the time. And I just wonder, was that fairly the uncertainty of that? I mean, my mother lost her parents in Auschwitz and her father, but lived with this uncertainty for, well, from January '43 until well into '47. Was that a common experience?
It was common, and in my case also very personal, because my father also became a POW, and my grandmother managed to survive the labor camp, and she didn't hear from my father until 1946. And that's when he managed to get out and go to Hungary. Some of these prisoners didn't leave until 1953. So there was a lot of uncertainty. Those that were there that late, usually there was already some news about them, but uncertainty was a terrible part of it. In the earlier periods, of course, they were allowed to send postcards back, and they did. We have postcards. They don't usually say a lot on the postcards, but they were signs of life. But somebody that became a POW, it was pretty hard to be in touch. And again, it happened much later. And there was actually organized activity by the Hungarian Jewish community after the liberation, after the fall of Budapest to the Soviets, and things began to organize, of actually trying to look for these men and to trace them and find out what happened to those that became POWs. Yeah. So that was really part of the story, for sure.
I think we have time for one last question. Is anybody else would like to ask one more question?
Yes, I'd like to ask a question. Am I being heard? Yes?
Yes.
Yeah. I have a few postcards from my father that was sent from forced labor, and it's got numbers on it like F437 and so on. Is it possible to work out where those locations are?
I don't know enough about it. This is again where I'd ask my friend in Hungary who worked in the National Archives. He might have some idea about what those numbers mean in terms of location or not. I honestly don't know. But maybe it's possible. Again, I'm going to put my email up on the chat. Anybody wants to write to me and ask me, then I'll look into it, or I'll give you the address of my friend in Hungary to ask, and then I'll apologize to him for giving him a flood of questions, but I'm sure that he'll deal with them well because he's a good guy.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, so if we can just turn to Vera to extend the vote of thanks, please.
Wow, that was so inspiring. I really don't know how to thank you, but I would like to thank Dr. Robert Rozett at this time for his very informative and inspiring presentation. It is important that we all take his words to heart. as Elie Wiesel also said, the Holocaust was not a man's inhumanity to man. The Holocaust was man's inhumanity to Jews. Please God, now that we have the state of Israel to protect us, this will never happen again. Thank you and good night to everyone.